of artist-run nonprofit organizations, or NGOs, a trend gaining momentum among social art practitioners. Despite the proliferation of these organizations, they're understudied, a symptom of their unstable positioning in any one field. Filing paperwork with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service might seem the most mundane aspect of art making, but I assure you it isn't. I'll suggest that this seemingly minor detail has become important for an increasing number of socially engaged artists because it enables them to, 1, provide a stable future for their work as funding for the arts continue to wane and waver, and 2, to navigate communities of which they're not a part, which most of the artists will tell you is the first step toward getting anything done. To get a sense for just how momentous the trend is, raise your hand if you know an artist or collaborative that has filed for nonprofit status or their country's equivalent. This is a test. So there's a few, maybe a third. This research is that I've done predominantly in the U.S., but also did recently in Holland as well, so I'm always curious where I go, how it's picking up. The title of my talk, Public Displays of Effection, alludes to the role of effect rather than affect in these artists' works, a role I think is too significant to remain taboo. By way of an introduction to the state of socially engaged art in the U.S., I want to tell you a story about the field's most notable advocate, Creative Time in New York. How many of you are familiar with Creative Time? Okay. When I woke up on October 24th, 2009, I had no intention of attending the Creative Time Summit that year called Revolutions in Public Practice. And so I missed the morning session, arriving just as the event was breaking for lunch. When I tried to buy a ticket for the afternoon session, a volunteer told me that there weren't any seats available. She said I could come back after the break to see about a standby ticket. And a half hour later, I returned only to wait another 30 minutes, wondering anxiously if I'd made the hour train trip from New Jersey for nothing. While waiting, I watched as people chanced upon the summit, which Creative Time held in the New York Public Library, an ideal location for a summit on public practice, which presumably seeks to engage the public. Wandering toward the forum door, however, these patrons were turned away by the volunteers. This is a private event, they said, a statement that exacerbated my already agitated state. A private summit on public practice. Surely the volunteer wasn't implying that the Creative Time Summit on Public Practice was a private event. Undoubtedly, she meant it was a ticketed affair, for which no tickets were available. I continued to wait, increasingly troubled by the homogenous swarm of well-dressed 30-somethings for gaining entry to the summit hall. Sure, I was to blame in part for not having purchased an advance ticket, but doing so would have meant belonging to a clique of Creative Time supporters, subscribing to the organization's listserv, or regularly visiting its website. Artist Vic Munoz, one of the presenters, later addressed the narrow graphic saying, "All I see is you." 10 minutes or so after the doors closed, an employee finally offered tickets to those of us waiting. I approached the table with another woman who was immediately denied admission for not having cash on hand and paid $25. Steep, I thought, for the student rate, in exchange for a white wristband, which I was told gave me access to the remaining 5 hours. I entered the event hall, found one of the many empty seats, and started to settle down. I questioned my initial presumption. Must a summit on public practice necessarily be public? And with this consideration in mind, asked, what do those in the know actually know about so-called revolutions in public practice, and what might a focused discussion among professionals in the field clarify about the state of such work? I was ready to listen, certain that the impressive roster of participants would offer some collective insight into contemporary public practice, its criticism, exhibition, and pedagogy. Other than a shared commitment to new genre public art, the summit presentations had no discernible focus, ranging from publications to community gardens and tackling everything from environmentalism to global capitalism and human rights abuses. The audience response, however, was concrete, overwhelming in its enthusiasm for discernibly activist projects, those that evidenced some measurable contribution to a given social problem. And yet I was troubled by how willingly everyone embraced a seemingly unavoidable conflation between the often activist content of socially engaged art and one of its forms, dialogue. Now bear with me as I digress from the summit momentarily to illustrate just what happens when critics and curators unwittingly do this. Ultimately, I think it shows how essential it is to reconsider the role of effectiveness. Creative Time Chief Curator Nato Thompson has become a spokesperson of sorts for socially engaged art. In his 2009 exhibition, It Is What It Is, Conversations About Iraq, a project by English artist Jeremy Deller, an example of what many would characterize as a socially engaged artwork. Over a 3-month period, Deller hosted a series of conversations about the Iraq War. Participants included a sergeant who served in the conflict, an Iraqi artist and journalist, and people across the U.S. as the exhibition traveled from New York to Los Angeles. Michelle White, curator at the Minot Collection in Houston, Texas, published an article about the project's visit there, in which she criticized the work. One, asking why, if working under the auspices of art, Deller made such a fervent attempt at neutrality, and two, postulating that more overtly couching the project as a work of art might have made it more compelling. Thompson published a rebuttal, asking how this would have made for, quote, compelling conversations. This project is about Iraq, he wrote, citing the veterans' impression of art-goers who, quote unquote, missed the point by asking about artistic precedent, funding, or venue. Can you see what's happening? The retaliation offers little regarding the circumstantial relationship between compelling conversations and compelling artworks. They're talking past each other. I think most of us here would agree socially engaged art needs a stronger linchpin between form or method, of which dialogue is one, and content. It needs what White describes pejoratively as lofty claims of social efficacy, a motivator that critics have until now dismissed in the same breath as they default to its appeal. Whether or not a strategy is effectively deployed in such a way that it means something for a given community is a question that anyone, Thompson, White, my grandmother, can talk about. Thompson misses an opportunity to test this line of questioning when he writes that Deller's motivation was to orchestrate a safe space to talk about the war. What if the emphasis wasn't on what's happening in the space so much as its characterization as safe? Using safety as a measurable hinge, Thompson and White might have had something useful to say to each other. Does couching a conversation about Iraq as an artwork provide safety? Were certain demographics excluded from the conversation, etc.? Instead, Thompson limits himself, saying it's not important what was said, but that something was or could be said. But a decade out from Beauriod and others before him, what's so revolutionary about that? The summit in New York drove the point home. What unified socially engaged artworks and made them compelling was the successful orchestration of unlikely exchanges between seemingly disparate groups, the impact of the exchange on the participants' worldview, and the fact that fellow artists were making this possible. In short, the revolutionary thing about public practice is that it's not only affective, but effective too. So what does Creative Time have to do with the establishment of artist-run NGOs? Well, it represents the state of socially engaged art in the U.S., and most of the projects they sponsor are, one, temporary, and two, urban. I know a few socially engaged artists who will tell you that having a conversation with a community member isn't so easy when you're not a member of that community, especially if that community is remote or you're more than passing through. Can you begin to see what kind of projects fall through the cracks